Welcome to session number 4 on global business environment. Ashokji, from the previous session that I had taken, do you have any doubts or should I just proceed? I'll proceed. All right. So in the previous session, we this is what we did. We did the theory of absolute cost advantage. We were trying to understand the various theories of international trade, which means the principles or the essence of why trade happens. So these theories have seen a development over decades, centuries, where they have emerged from being a classical theory of absolute and comparative cost advantage to being a Porter's five model theory. There are various, so the development of a new theory does not render the previous theory absolutely redundant or obsolete or useless. It just builds another perspective into the theory of international trade and makes us understand why trade would take place among nations. So in the theory of absolute cost advantage, we saw how if there are two countries in a two country, two good model, if there are two countries producing two goods, how one country may have an absolute cost advantage in the production of one commodity, and country B may have an absolute cost advantage in the production of another commodity. And that is why trade may thrive between these two nations. So each of the two nations will only produce and trade or export the commodity that it has an absolute cost advantage in. But and it had its own restrictions that if there can be a scenario where one country does not have or may have an absolute cost disadvantage in the production of any two commodities, will they trade or will trade thrive or kind of benefit the nation which has an absolute cost disadvantage? It failed to explain the fact. And globally, trade happens or takes place among nations even when one country has an absolute cost advantage in the production of every good, for example, the US, while the other country may have an absolute cost advantage in the production of all the goods, for example, let's say Africa. But even then, trade does take place. So it fails to explain that aspect of international trade. And again, it's restricted to two country, two commodities. So we don't know how it is going to be applicable in the real case scenario where there are many countries and many commodities, that's goods and services being traded. Howsoever, we do see this apply in case of countries like Africa, which have an absolute cost advantage in mining and in the production of certain fruits and fruit juices. That continent is very high in some precious stones like diamond, uh, gold and platinum, and is considered to be the world's largest repository of these minerals or ores. So any a special type of diamond is also found in Africa. So these mining companies ship this diamond to jewelry manufacturers all over the world. So Africa does enjoy an absolute advantage in the mining of these mineral metals, that is platinum, gold, and chromium. And it's the kind of climate it has also gives it an advantage, or it's very favorable to the production of grapes and fruits. So it can grow these fruits for longer time period or duration in a year, and thus is a main exporter of wine and fruit juices. So we do see that this kind of theory is applicable even today, even though it has some restrictions. Coming on to the theory of absolute or comparative cost advantage. So the second scenario that we discussed, that countries will trade even if one country has an absolute cost advantage in the production of both the commodities. So we will change the previous example, only use that example and understand what happens will two countries still trade with each other. So this theory was propounded by Ricardo. He's also a classical school economist. This is also a classical theory, but just came up kind of challenging the shortcomings of the absolute cost advantage theory, which was um, given by Adam Smith. And both these economists, Adam Smith and Ricardo, were proponents of free trade. And that is why they came up with the theories of international trade. So the assumptions still remain the same, that there are two countries and two commodities with no technical change and no transport costs. So transport costs are definitely not considered, because when the transport costs and other barriers to trade are taken into account, then the whole dynamics of trade changes. So we will have to keep that as absent or so nominal that it does not cause a lot of change to the cost of the price of the commodity. So let's understand that, and in a given time period, technology always remains the same. It does not change. It may change in the next time period. We are assuming competition to be perfect in both the commodity and the factor market. So what are the implications of perfect competition? Perfect competition means that there is free entry and exit of firms. The prices are determined by the market and the level of output. There is no government intervention. There is no imperfection in the market in terms, so that there is no distortion in the market that we call imperfection, which means that prices will not be, there is no degree of control any producer or consumer has on price. There are no barriers to entry into the industry, and that is how the prices will remain stable or in equilibrium, in a stable equilibrium, because as the demand grows, more firms can enter the industry and produce and supply the market to that extent. While if the demand falls, the firms are free to exit the industry, and so it maintains that level of allocative and productive efficiency. And both the consumer and producer have perfect knowledge, and there is free market mechanism, no government intervention. So that is essentially what perfect competition means. And the market can be any market, even the factor market where the factors are bought and sold, factors of production, is also a market where perfect competition must prevail, which means that there should be no government intervention and no price control even there. Labor is the only factor. So for simplicity, we assume, and it was fairly okay to assume this in the early 19th century, because labor was essentially the main, or the kind of overwhelming factor of production, with very little uh, of capital or machines being used. We were still, the countries were industrializing, and the mechanization of production processes was quite in its inception phase. So factors of production, labor was the sole factor of production. Homogeneously efficient, which means that if he has to, each labor would give the same level of efficiency or output. One will not be different from the other. And even if they were to move from one industry into another, their efficiency will remain the same. Now, that was a big assumption made, because this may not always be true. One, between two labors also efficiency levels differ, and two, one labor may be more efficient in the agricultural industry and may not be as efficient in the manufacturing industry, or vice versa. But here, a homogeneity of efficiency has been assumed. And then they are perfectly mobile within the country, which means within the country, they will move freely from one industry into another. So the inter-industry movement of this factor of production is absolutely perfect here. And which means that with the same amount of ease, a labor can become a part of any industry without having to undergo any training, or being in any kind of structural unemployment or transitional unemployment. That is not present. Free trade and constant returns to scale. Free trade means that there are no barriers to trade among nations. But at the same time, point number 3, again, the mobility of this factor between two nations is perfectly immobile, which means that it's non-existent. Labor will only move within the country, but not move to another country. So, free trade means no barriers to trade, and constant returns to scale means that there are constant cost conditions in the industry, and the demand conditions are also stable. And we can assume this for a given time period that we are considering. It may change in the next time period. Given these assumptions, and full employment in both the countries means that if means that there is no unemployment of resources, and the trade is on barter system, means that two countries are trading amongst themselves on comparative cost advantage. They can trade maize for tea or tea for maize. That is how they are going to trade. Now, the statement of the theory says that if a country has an absolute advantage in the production of both the commodities, it will specialize in the production of only that good that it can produce most efficiently, and will exchange and must exchange or trade in the goods that it produces less efficiently. Even if I go back to the previous example of absolute cost advantage, you will realize that if I were to uh, just to study the production cost of country A for maize and tea, I will realize that greater efficiency might lie in the production of one commodity as compared to the production of other commodity, which means that more of one commodity can be produced with the given factor of production, units of factor of production, as compared to another commodity, that is between maize and tea, even though it may have an absolute cost advantage over country B in the production of both the commodities. Ashokji, please feel free to stop me and ask a question. And Vinay and Fatima, wherever you feel you are not able to understand or are getting confused, right? Or you can put your query in the chat box also. I'll keep the chat box open. Right. Now, so two countries, A and B, both can produce maize and tea. Total available resources for both the countries are 400 units. And as we have presumed that the labor is freely mobile, perfectly mobile only within each specific country, we do assume that with the given resources, we will find, or we will discover that both countries have a greater efficiency in the production of only one commodity, even despite the absolute cost advantage they may have. So country A has, you see here, country A has an absolute cost advantage in the production of both. So if it utilizes, so let's take the case of country A. It has 400 units of labor at its disposal. If it utilizes 400 units of labor for the production of maize, it will end up producing 20 units of maize, which means 400 divided by 20 will be 20, units of labor which are used for the production of uh, per ton of maize. So 20 tons of maize means that to produce each ton of maize, it requires 20 labors. And uh, if it on the other hand, if it were to employ entire resources in the production of tea, it produces 15 tons of tea, which means you divide 400 by 15, and you will, let me just open the calculator, or somebody can do the maths and let me know. Just let me open the calculator. All right, so 400 divided by 15, it takes 26.67 units of labor to produce each ton of tea. Let me, yeah, 26.67. Pardon my writing. I don't have the pen. Now, let's look at the case of country B. Country B also has 400 units of labor at its disposal. So country B, if it employs or deploys all the 400 units of labor for the production of maize, it can produce 5 units or tons of maize. So how much resources are getting consumed here to produce each ton of maize? 80 units of labor. On the contrary, if it were to employ all the labor, 400 units of labor to produce to produce only tea, it is going to produce 10 tons of tea, which means 40 units of labor go into the production of each ton of tea. Now, if I were to compare this per unit cost, then there is a comparative advantage that country A has in the production of maize and country B has in the production of tea, right? Comparatively, it is better off producing maize, country A, and country B is better off producing tea. Now, with trade, what happens? Now they will, country A exchanges it. So what are the two countries doing? Now, in the first situation, if neither country trades with each other, this is what the total production worldwide is going to be, right? You are going to produce, you're going to deploy half your resources. Country A will deploy half its resources, that's 200 units of labor in the production of maize and or 200 units of labor and the rest in the production of tea. So using half its resources there and there, it is going to be able to produce 20 plus the total world global production of maize is going to be 25 units and of tea is going to be also 25 units. But let us suppose a situation where country is going to trade in the second situation, if each country were to specialize, then country A will produce 30 units of maize and by using 300 units of, so they will mostly deploy, I'm not saying they will deploy 400 units of labor to the production of of maize only. What they are going to do is they will deploy 300 units for the production of maize, and that is sufficient for their internal demand to meet the internal demand for maize. And they will use the remaining 100 units for the production of tea. So utilizing 300 units of labor for the production of maize, they are going to be able to produce 30 tons of maize and using the remaining 100 units of labor for the production of tea, they will utilize, they will produce 7.5 tons of tea. Now country B is going to put all its resources because country B has a comparative cost disadvantage, absolute cost disadvantage in both. So it is going to only absolutely concentrate on the production of tea, because if it divides its resources 300 to 100 in for both the commodities, it may the problem with it is its efficiency is less than half in the production of maize, as you saw on the previous table. So it is going to produce 20 tons of tea. Now let the exchange happen. So it only needs, so what country A is going to do is it is going to exchange 8 tons of maize with country B for 8 tons of tea, because it only needs 20 tons of maize. Now it is still left with 2 additional tons of maize that way, if you see. So with trade, so now 22 tons of maize and has a total of now 7.5 it is producing internally and 8 tons it is taking from uh, country B. Now, what it does is country B has now 8 tons of maize with it, which it has taken from country A, and will have 11.5 tons of tea. tea, 12 tons of tea left here because it has given away 8 tons. So what is the total production of maize now globally? 38 tons. And the total production of tea now globally is 20 tons. This is one way to look at it, as against 25 tons and 25 tons of, here for 20, as against 25 tons and of maize and 25 tons of tea. The world now has 38 tons of maize globally, right? It is and 15.5 plus 20 is 35.5 tons of tea. So there is a global, there is definitely both the countries have benefited from trade, although country A had an absolute advantage in the production of both the commodities, and country B was an absolute cost disadvantage. Even then, with trade, both the countries have benefited, and the global production for maize and tea has gone up to by let's say 25, okay, 13 tons in maize and 15.5 plus 12 is 27.5 versus 25, 2.5 tons in tea. So there is advantage. So what they were trying to say, what he was trying to say here, Ricardo, is that even in case of absolute cost disadvantage, our country gains by trading internationally freely. You know, we are assuming free trade, right? Free trade here. Look at the fourth assumption. So the idea here was that no restrictions to trade must exist. So it is a restrictive model, but again, only two commodities, two countries. So it becomes a restrictive model. It is based on the assumption is of full employment, and full employment is not a very good assumption to make, because mostly countries have to deal with a lot of unemployment of resources in the whole factor market. So there, even if we are considering only one factor of production, labor, there is a lot of labor unemployment that the countries have to deal with. It ignores transportation costs, whereas transportation costs are a major cost that countries or companies incur when they want to indulge into trade. So it has completely ignored it. So that is something which becomes a limiting factor here. Mobility, a factor of production, they have assumed perfect immobility of labor. That's the only factor of production they're taking here between countries. But the truth is that factor is nowadays very mobile even between countries. There is no immobility of labor that is uh, that is now experienced. No free trade. In reality, the free trade concept still does not exist, even though today we are a very, very globalized world. There are barriers to trade. You see the current scenario where Trump is indulging, where US, let's just use the country here, where the United States is indulging in a trade war by levying higher and higher tariffs on countries. So that is the reality. Complete specialization. No country completely specializes in the production of one commodity. Mostly countries are specializing in the production of countries are producing a lot of commodities, but they do focus on the production of that commodity which they have a comparative cost advantage. But complete specialization, at the table shows here, does not exist, because you may be at a real disadvantage with complete specialization. For example, if the US decides completely not to produce agricultural commodities, it may be at an absolute disadvantage, because it will be absolutely dependent on on a country like Ukraine, which was the breadbasket of Europe, considered to be the breadbasket of the world, for its agricultural needs, where Ukraine has now been completely destroyed, demolished in war. So there's no agricultural support in such a scenario that US would have bought. So its population would have gone hungry, and they would have been looking for another trading partner. But that in reality, no country completely specializes in the production of one commodity. Constant returns to scale is also not what we can assume all the time, because countries, industries. So industries do face increasing as well as decreasing returns to scale. Okay. Now, labor theory of value. So in theory, the cost of production and the value of a commodity is expressed in terms of labor hours or days required to produce one unit of a commodity. And the exchange rate of commodities is determined on the basis of labor required to produce each good in each of the two countries. So now this makes it a completely labor theory of value, which means that the cost of production is completely determined by how much labor is used in the production of a commodity. Although there is no exchange rate that is, and the exchange rate is also determined by the labor value only. So which may not, which is again a very, very limiting factor, because there is a lot more that goes into understanding the cost of production and determining the exchange rate of a commodity in terms of others. So barter is not always the case, and cost comparisons and cost calculations are not as simple as understanding only labor cost all the time, right? So, so this theory also had its own criticisms, although we do see in reality a lot of competitive advantages exist globally on which countries thrive. Like Canada, Canada has competitive salary costs. It has a world-class infrastructure. It has outstanding quality of life at an affordable cost, and it has a highly skilled labor force. So that becomes its competitive advantage in automotive sector, with a proportion of workforce in transport equipment manufacturing higher than Detroit, southern US states, and comparable to Germany. So even our countries do have comparative cost advantages. India has a comparative cost advantage, and India has for labor costs. And that is why the knowledge sector is growing, because we have highly skilled labor. Although the difference in labor skill is huge, which means we have either highly skilled labor, which is niche labor required for the service sector, or we have labor that is very unskilled and can only accommodate or work in the agricultural sector. And that is why the manufacturing sector is by and large absent in India. And the current government's consistent efforts for the past 1 decade have also not produced desirable results, because we have failed to upskill our agricultural labor so that they can transition smoothly into the manufacturing sector industry. So, and then China also has a lot of comparative advantage, one in terms of highly skilled labor that is English speaking, and two, a very robust infrastructure and very high technological advancement that countries can take advantage of. So this theory is cannot be outrightly rejected. Heckscher-Ohlin theory of factor endowment, or the factor endowment theory, we have done in the previous class. Kindly listen to the recording. Now we come to the product life cycle theory, also has been done. Now we come to the Porter's 5 forces. So this was 5 forces is a framework for understanding the competitive forces at work in an industry, which drive the way economic value is divided among industry actors. So it is one model that was drawn. It is not a model that rejects all the previous models, but it suggests that the success in any industry is going to depend on essentially 5 forces. And these 5 forces are displayed on the screen. So it was first described by Michael Porter in 1979 in a Harvard Business Review article. And his insights then started almost like they brought about a revolutionary change in the strategic field. And they continue to shape business practice and academic thinking today. So the five forces analysis can help companies assess industry attractiveness, how trends will affect industry competition, and which industries a company should compete in, and how companies can position themselves for success. So the first force is here, the bargaining power of the consumer or the buyer. Customer is the buyer. So a customer is powerful and they can use their clout to force prices down or demand more service at existing prices. That is the power of the consumer. So, and it so they generally bargain and they're successful in capturing more value for their own self. So buyer power is the highest when buyers are relatively large in comparison to the number of suppliers present, and they represent a significant and products are large to the competitors serving them, and the products are undifferentiated. And so there is very low switching cost. They can, so if in an undifferentiated product, the problem is that the substitutes available in the market are absolutely perfect, which means that for a buyer to switch from one supplier to the other is not going to take him, is not going to, he's going to be indifferent in doing that, because the consumer is, because the product is not differentiated at all. So they can play rivals against each other. Especially if an industry's products are undifferentiated, it is inexpensive to switch loyalties, and price trumps quality. So there are multiple buyer segments in a given industry with different level of power. So so you can, in practice in the airline industry, we see despite the fragmentation of buyers, airlines have a hard time differentiating themselves from each other in terms of service provided and creating a customer loyalty. For me as a consumer, I'm very indifferent in choosing a flight from destination A to destination B. My only factor is in consideration is price most of the time, because switching costs for me are nearly non-existent. And so the budget airlines are proliferating these days, and they completely play on price levels. Now comes the second force, which is the bargaining power of the producer. Now, producer also has a lot of bargaining power, or they are able to get it for themselves by trying to illegally have a collusion with each other. So companies in every industry purchase inputs from suppliers, which account for differing proportions of cost, right? So depending on the kind of production function I have as company A, company B, company C, company D in the same industry, my input costs are going to vary depending on my input mix. So powerful suppliers use their negotiating power to leverage, better prices, or in charging a higher price to the consumer. So so these are called the barometric firms in the industry, where by sheer experience or the sheer size, they are able to be the price leader in the industry. Right. So if there are only one or two suppliers in an industry, I mean, where you can count the number of suppliers, like even it applies to airlines, then a supplier group tends to have more power by trying to have an understanding with each other. So if each of the supplier decides to charge the same price, then the consumer is trumped this time. So for example, the bargaining in bargaining power for suppliers in the airline industry is also very high, because each of the supplier groups are highly concentrated and has a huge cost impact. So the airlines often face a very high cost of switching supplier, because of the benefit of fleet compatibility and the necessity for utilizing major airports. So that is the reason why suppliers often collude with each other to retain their bargaining power. The third is the threat of new entrants. So the threat, new entrants in the industry are those who are lured by the by profits, by higher profits, and they enter the industry to take away a share of the pie. So in the industry, the threat of entry, now why it is considered to be a threat? Because the existing players are right now enjoying higher profits because they are trying to supply a market which is huge, and probably because the supply is short, or they are able to keep it shorter, lesser than demand, they are able to command a higher price, and hence the profits are higher. But when new entrants come into the industry, they are going to push the supply up, and this profit margin is going to definitely come down, because in order to dent the market or take away a share of the market, they will come with more competitive prices. And as competition increases in an industry, it tends to bring down profit margins for the suppliers. So entry also brings new capacity and its own pressures on both price and cost. So now all the firms in the industry have a pressure to reduce their costs and makes the prices more competitive in order to stay relevant. So the threat of entry puts a cap on profit potential of any industry. So this depends on the size of uh, barriers. Now, how difficult it is to enter an industry is going to depend on what kind of barriers to entry an industry has. What are the barriers to industry? Barriers to industry can be anything like a very high capital investment industry. For example, if you want to have your own airline, it is quite a barrier to industry. The capital cost requirement here to enter this industry is so huge that in itself becomes a barrier to entry. For a person like me or you, it may be quite a significant barrier. Therefore, you don't see so many players in the industry. The number of players are very, very limited, right? So it also in another barrier to entry can be the economies of scale, which means that you must produce at a minimum scale in order to keep your prices, in order to get your average cost of production down so that you can have a competitive price, because the market has already determined a price. You cannot enter the market and start charging a 10,000 per sector, flying between for a 2-hour distance, whereas the market is throwing a price of 5,500 to 6,000 at different times of the year, at different times of the day, and on different days of the week, right? And you can cut your average cost down only when you produce at a significant scale of output. Otherwise, the average cost of production remains very, very, very high. So that is going to make you a loss-making entity, and you might have to exit the industry. The marketing and sales is a significant cost that can also be a barrier to entry if for a particular sector your marketing and sales investment is supposed to be very high in order to build brand awareness, right? There can be other barriers to entry, like government restrictions can be there, or accessing or some kind of control over the supply and distribution channels of a few firms in the industry. Now, the airline industry has continued to grow, and the cost of entry is now not as high as compared to what used to be in the past. There are lesser barriers to entry because the governments of all the countries have slowly opened this sector to foreign investment. Even 100% foreign investment is allowed. There is greater availability of finance, of skilled professionals, and access to gates, because there are bigger and more all encompassing airports. So there is a steady stream of new airlines. So foreign airlines coming into the Indian industry, the number of airlines has grown in the past few decades. So new airlines often have the advantage due to less senior. So new airlines will come and they will hire new personnel, which is a significant cost, because labor comes at a cost, right? So if you are a new airline, you hire people who are, you can have, there is less seniority, so you can have lower pay scales, lower wages, and newer aircrafts they will lease, so they can have better fuel efficiency. So many things are favorable to an entry into the industry. So threat of new entrants is also going to significantly impact the success of firms in the industry. Next comes the threat of substitutes. Okay. What is threat of substitute? So when a new product or service meets some basic need in a different way, industry profitability definitely suffers. For example, when mobile phones are meeting the requirement of a camera, the camera industry is definitely suffering unless it does something new or innovative. So video conferencing is similarly is an alternative to traveling. Yeah, so you don't have to travel to a destination. It can be within the same country or outside, to a foreign location, because you can do video conferencing now. So travel industry is threatened by lesser travel due to the advent and growth of technology, uh, continuous growth of technology, right? Email becomes a substitute for express mail. So you see how postal services are dying. They are mostly getting phased out because of emailing. Now, letters in India, you see the inland letters and the blue, they are basically out of business. The government has decided to withdraw them completely. While the services will still survive on lesser, they will give only, they maybe only transporting mail from one location to another nationally and internationally, but not transporting letters now, because letters have been replaced by phones, video calls, and emails, right? Now WhatsApp is there, even emails have become redundant, right? To a lot of great extent. So there is a threat of a substitute, and it is very, very high if it offers an attractive price performance trade-off related to the industry's product, and the buyer's cost of switching to the substitute is low. So for example, threat of substitute for, if we are taking airline industry, is low. For postal services is high. For camera industry is also high, because for short haul travels, you can have substitute like road or kind of rail travel. But for long haul distances, you still don't have any other substitute apart from air travel, because you can't be taking a ship all the time and spending like a month or 15 days. We have also lack of time. Now comes internal competition or rivalry. This is the fifth force. If rivalry is intense, it often erupts into a price war. Like you see in the telecom industry these days in India, it drives down prices or kind of dissipates the profit by raising the cost of competing. Competition comes at a cost. One, you have to keep on driving, pushing the prices down in order to stay relevant. Sometimes you are driven down to a point, the prices are driven down to a point where they don't even cover the cost of production, like it is happening in the case of mobile telephony in India, right? So companies come out, and then when the rivalry is intense, the cost of advertising and marketing strategy, the cost of advertising and marketing activities, right? It really spikes. So you have to invest more and more in order to create that value in the mind of the consumer and stay relevant, keep resonating with your consumers. So rivalry is fierce when either the number of competitors are numerous, or the industry growth is slow. There are high barriers to entry, barriers that I've already explained, or even the exit. So are barriers to entry, you have barriers to exit also. So the example can be where airlines like Kingfisher and Jet have still not been able to exit the market, because they are still in litigation because of a lot of liabilities they are yet to clear. So in the apps, in face of that, they are not able to their legal requirements are not yet met. So if you are in India, you are behind the bars and the case is going on, or you have to flee the country and go and start staying in a country where there's no extradition treaty. So this happens when the exit barriers are so high that you're unable to exit the industry even after shutting down operations, right? And so this is now there are numerous airlines who compete for every route at an international level, or even if you look at the national routing system here in India. So now differentiation is low or absolutely absent, fixed, or it's very insignificant. To me as a consumer, differentiation does not matter if I have to travel a 2-hour distance. For me, price is the determining factor when I'm choosing one airline over the other, and definitely the time in which a flight is operating. Correct? So there is a constant pressure in such a scenario for price competition and to match improvements in technology, cabin features, how poorly maintained or well maintained the cabin is, and customer service, which means how affable or amicable your own crew members are, what kind of service you're providing in the flight or even outside. So the provision of the reputation of Air India really suffered a big blow when there is a post that is going viral. It's everywhere, and their case has been filed against Air India, where an old passenger was denied a wheelchair, and hence she fell down. The passenger fell down at the airport and sustained a lot of injuries. So in this scenario, this is called customer service. So it is actually denting Air India's image in providing good customer service. So any such incidents have to be avoided. This is called Porter's National Competitive Advantage Model and explains the factors on which the success of a firm in the industry is heavily, heavily dependent. So it synthesizes many features of country level and firm level theories. So firm-based theories are different, country-based theories are different, global competition is different, and domestic competition is sometimes different, and intra-industry competition is different. It takes care of everything here, right? It brings in a lot of features. So let me just see. Give me 5 minutes of transitioning time, and I'm going to put a new uh, uh, PPT, display a new PPT, and we are going to resume. All right. So just give me 5 minutes. Okay, before I move on to the next topic, I would like to pose some questions to the class, and let's see if you can answer them. So my first question is, which of the following is not an assumption of mercantilism? That there is limited amount of wealth in the world. A nation should try to maintain favorable balance of trade, and gold and silver reflect the economic condition of a nation. Out of the three, which you think is the right answer for question one? I expect some kind of participation from the class. Mr. Ashok? Mr. Ashok Kumar, you were there in my previous class. Would you like to answer this question? You can type your answers also, or please let me know if you do not have the right to unmute, I can. Okay, I've allowed Mike to you. Can you unmute and answer?
Yeah, the answer is A, madam. Thanks for
Sorry?
unmuting.
Yeah.
The
No,
answer is A. There is a limited amount of wealth in the world. Is
okay.
not an
So
assumption of
yes,
that.
that the remaining two are correct because there is not a limited, but they use the word finite for it. There is a finite amount of wealth. It doesn't mean that it is limited. Okay, there's a difference between the term finite and limited. So there is no limited but finite amount of wealth in the world, and definitely these two are correct, which are the underlying concepts of mercantilism. France has an absolute advantage in the production of which product? Textile, automobile, or wine? It's open to the class. Everybody, each of you can unmute and ask.
Wine, 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 madam.
Wine. So So wine, let's look at the answers here. It's option A and option C. France has an absolute advantage in the production of wine. So so yes, right? So now let me just stop sharing this and share. Okay. Okay. Module 3, international trade. We just continue with this module, and what we are going to deal with is the multilateral trading system. So when there is international trade, there is a multilateral trading system that has come into existence after the Second World War, in the post-World War era, because nations identified the need to cooperate with each other if they had to grow in terms of income, wealth, and other parameters of production, employment, consumption. So we will discuss what a multilateral trading system is, the functions, principles, and organization of WTO. So WTO is the major organization that oversees this international trade. It administers international trade. It frames the guidelines or the laws that the countries must abide by if they have to be a part of the global trade order. And then it also provides a mechanism for adjudication of any dispute related to trade. So if the two trading partners enter into there is a dispute between them related to trade, they can go to their dispute mechanism. They can go to their court of arbitration and settle the dispute. So WTO provides that mechanism as well. The concept, benefit, and kinds of regional economic agreement. I will see if we can go to cover that today. It will be, we might just do it in the next class. Okay, so yeah. So what is a multilateral trading system? A multilateral trading system, multilateral. So there is unilateral, there is bilateral, there is multilateral. What is the difference between bilateral and multilateral and plurilateral? So there can be plurilateral trade, there can be multilateral trade, there can be bilateral trade. So, or there are bilateral relationship, plurilateral relationship, multilateral. So what is the difference? Somebody can tell me? Somebody can tell me what's the difference between plurilateral, bilateral, and multilateral? Students? Any one of you can answer, not just Ashok community. Bi means two, right? So if there are talks or there is any kind of agreement between two nations, two countries, we call it bilateral. Okay, anything, even trade can be bilateral if it is between two nations. There is if more than one nation is involved, we call it plurilateral. It can be between 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 countries, right? But a multilateral trading system or an organization or any kind of talks, multilateral engages the entire world. So that is what multilateral means, and the difference between pluri and multilateral is this. Pluri does not mean multilateral because multilateral means the entire world. Is this clear? So a multilateral corporation is one that can so we have a multilateral corporation. So multilateral corporation becomes a kind of corporation that is going to operate from several countries in addition to the country in which it has been incorporated, and we call that country its home country. So an IBM, if it's incorporated in the US, which means if it has come into existence, you know what an incorporated, you know what incorporation of an organization is? What are incorporated and unincorporated businesses? What is an incorporated business? An incorporated business is the one that has been registered legally in any country. So if you get incorporated in the US, you have been registered there by law to be a limited company, right? A public limited or a private limited company. But you are an unincorporated organization if you are just running your business without getting incorporated or getting registered as a business. You can be a vendor, a street vendor. You can be a small store or a shop, which is not a registered brand or store, but you're just operating from one location. Or but the moment you want to operate from more than one location, you need to be incorporated. So the country in which you're incorporated becomes your home country, and the country from where else you can operate are your host countries. So multilateral corporations are those that operate from several countries apart from the one where they have been incorporated. So apart from the home country, they are operating out of several host countries. So they own, control, and operate business activities from more than one country. Now, we don't call it plurilateral organization or a trading system, a plurilateral organization, because there is no limits to the number of companies from which you can operate, although we can count, but there is no limit. So we don't consider, there is nothing called a plurilateral organization. There's only a multilateral organization that is operating from more than one country. So now there are global corporations and there are international corporations, and there are multilateral corporations. We use these terms interchangeably, but there is a difference in these terminologies. And international, when manufacturing and production facilities are centralized in one or two countries. For example, uh, it can be Harley Davidson. Now, Harley Davidson is manufactured only in the US. It's produced, the manufacturing facility is only located in one country, but it is marketed in several countries, right? So this can become a global corporation because now it is able to reap advantage of economies of scale, and it can also base its production unit in something like in India to cater to the market close by, which is the Southeast Asian market and the Middle East market. And the remaining market, it caters from its US location. So these are called global organizations or corporations. Uh, when uh, uh, when manufacturing and production, both facilities are completely decentralized, it becomes a multinational corporations, because which means that you are not just manufacturing from various locations, but you are also you are manufacturing and producing from various locations, not just one. So you split your production process into various sub processes that can be located in various parts of the world in order to take advantage of of tariffs, of taxes, of expertise or skills of a particular area, of cost advantages in a particular area. In order to stay relevant, you need to have some cost advantage as well. So these kind of advantages can be. This becomes a multilateral organization where it is a completely decentralized one, right? And an international organization is nothing, you become an international organization the moment you start selling or sourcing from international markets. So not just marketing internationally, but even sourcing internationally can make you an international organization. So there are stages of a company becoming a multilateral lateral organization. I will just see if this here. Yeah, so here it is. So I'll first take you through this. So the first stage of a growth of a multinational corporation is you being a domestic company. So you're only a domestic organization. You're only producing and selling within the boundaries of a particular nation. So your approach remains very ethnocentric. You're very, very ethnocentric in approach. Ethnocentricity of culture means so your cultural approach is ethnocentric, and ethnocentricity means that you presume that what you're manufacturing, the way you're manufacturing, your business practices, values, your human resources, and your organization is by far the best. And you don't want to change your practices to adapt to any other culture which may be outside. So if you are a national organization, which means if you're a domestic company, you will be very ethnocentric in your cultural approach because there is no reason why you should be adapting to different cultures worldwide. The second step to becoming an MNC is you become an international company. By becoming an international company, you try to extend your business operations like marketing, manufacturing, and other activities beyond the national boundaries of your home country. So an international company also is very, very ethnocentric in its cultural orientation or approach because it is only spreading its services outside the national boundaries, still believing that its pursuits, value system, beliefs, conduct of business, policies, human resources are all by far the best, and there is no reason why they should be adapting to or adopting um, any other orientation which can, for example, there is a lot of cultural difference between the US, India, and Europe. If you go to other Southeast Asian countries, if you are in Pakistan, Afghanistan, so if you are intending to do business in the entire world, you cannot survive with an ethnocentric approach because you might just be rejected by other cultures because you fail to adapt to their cultural values, beliefs, or the cultural systems. Now, stage three is you become a multinational organization. Now, when an international company discovers the difference in the market of different companies and tries to adapt its product and marketing strategies or the product mix or the marketing mix according to the demands and needs of the foreign countries or other consumers in different countries, it starts becoming a multinational organization. So their approach starts changing from being ethnocentric to one that is polycentric in nature. And poly means many. So if you have polycentricity, it means that according to each region or country, you will change your product and marketing mix. For example, Toyota and Sony have adopted this kind of a strategy where they give where they look at the different aspects of national market and try to meet the foreign preferences and practices. So, for example, when Toyota entered the US market, it entered with its car called Toyo Pet, right? But it in 1957, but Toyopet failed to impress the US consumers, and it completely closed down. Now, the orientation that Toyota had at that time was very, very ethnocentric, and it presumed that what it was selling in Japan would also sell in the US market. But when it actually, the reality hit it hard when when it had to ship back its unsold units to into Japan. So Toyota took this market rejection of Toyopet as a major learning experience, and it started researching on marketing and product preferences in order to cater to the US market. So it had to change from being ethnocentric to being polycentric in its approach. Now, stage four is when you become a global company. So a global company can either have a global marketing strategy or a global sourcing strategy, as I told you. For example, a company can start sourcing from various parts of the world the intermediate products or the parts that it needs to manufacture the final good, and assemble or manufacture only in its home country, right? That is also a global organization, while it is also going to sell it in its home country only. But however, it can also have a marketing, it can manufacture in its own country using the indigenous parts and intermediate parts and labor, other factors of production, while it can extend its selling activities to other countries, which means that it can internationally sell that product. And the example that I gave of Harley Davidson, that it designs and manufactures those heavyweight motorcycles in US and targets markets all over the world. So it is not adapting to different markets by trying a product mix that is more suitable to different market conditions, but it keeps the design and marketing strategies the same and just sells it to the entire world. Now, transnational organization. Now, transnational is to think globally and act locally. That is the motive of a transnational organization. These are very complicated. They have a geocentric approach, different from polycentric, which means that you have to forget about ethnocentricity. You adapt to local market needs, consumer preferences. So you keep designing the product and marketing strategy mix according to the local requirements. So according to geographical conditions or different for different geographies, you have different approaches. So you become a geocentric in your cultural approach. So it recognizes the similarities and differences in different markets around the world and tries to adapt to them. And they follow a global strategy to also minimize these adaptation in different countries. So what they do, for example, the main features of a transnational organization is that it disperses all its activities globally, and but the operations remain interdependent and specialized also, which means that your R&D can be spread across the world. Your manufacturing process can be spread across the world according to the to cost competitiveness and according to the government, the attractiveness of a particular location due to various diplomatic, political, economic, and other factors. So, for example, Caterpillar has a manufacturing facility in several countries. And what is Caterpillar? They generally make those heavy earth moving vehicles, the earth movers. They make earth movers, and they make those construction vehicles, or you can say those machines that are used in construction. So they have manufacturing facilities in several countries and assembling services in yet other countries. So you have to give construction and assembling services in various countries. So, manufacturing can happen somewhere, and assembly can happen at different. So there are a lot of intra-company transfers that happen in such an organization, which means that parts and subparts are made at different location and transported to a location where they are going to be finally assembled and then shipped to customers in different countries. So multinational corporations So these multinational corporations are very, very large in size. They operate internationally. These are the main features. They are mostly oligopolistic in nature. What does that mean? Wherever they go, they have so much resources at a global level that they generally are able to buy out competition, and they become an oligopoly. They operate like in the aerated drink segment. You mostly see all the drinks being owned, manufactured, marketed now by either Pepsi or Coke. So Pepsi or Coca-Cola. So there is no third, there is no indigenous manufacturer left in India. All were bought by these two to completely crowd out competition, and to make sure that they would now be able to sell at a price that the two of them will agree. They can avoid the price war between the two of them, and they can decide on a price. And so all drinks of 200 ml, 150 ml, 600 are priced similarly for either Pepsi or Coca-Cola. There is no difference in pricing. They are and they facilitate transfer of resources. A lot of technical know-how, equipment, machinery, and finished products and managerial services there's a multi-country facility. There's a lot of transfer of resources happening in multinational corporations. Right. So Sony is one such organization that started with an assembly of operation fed with components from Japan, and later decided to source many components from within the US, except the critical component like the special integrated chips. So they can either source or market internationally, right? Going back to the previous slide, do you have any questions thus far? Okay. So a multilateral trading system can be understood by one which is been framed by intergovernmental bargaining process, which has set rules for international trade, and which has a dispute settlement mechanism now when after WTO came into existence. So the first component of a multilateral trading system is that prior to the formation of WTO, there was GATT, that is the General Agreement in Trade and Tariff. GATT was not an organization, but it was an understanding that was to which there were a lot of signatories worldwide after the Second World War, and the world has seen the Great Depression between the two wars, and they wanted to avoid another similar economic recession or depression at a global level. So what the countries decided was that, and even at that time, the idea was to make an international trade organization, which was a full-fledged organization headquartered in some country like WTO is headquartered in Geneva, which is going to forward the interest or the Adam Smith and the Ricardo principle of free trade, bring down all barriers to trade in form of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and forward the concept of free trade among nations at a global level. However, US was opposed to the idea. So eventually, it was just an agreement that was signed by few countries, like 57 countries, if I'm not wrong, and that came to be known as the General Agreement of Trade and Tariff. Now, how it functioned was that it was not an organization which was headquartered in at one location in US or Europe somewhere. It was just a round of agreements or that are going to be discussed, that will be discussed among the signatories of this agreement, where the countries, the partner countries or the countries will negotiate tariffs to bring down tariffs on various goods that were being traded. Now, at that point in time, the trade was only in tangible goods. There were no services. It was absolutely non-existent. So what GATT dealt with mostly at that time was trade in goods. So all the member countries would sit down to discuss how tariff barriers can be pulled down for various goods among various countries, right? So it happened, it was basically rounds of discussion that happens among member countries. The member countries kept growing, and you have the Geneva round of discussion agreement. And in the end, in 1986, the Uruguay round of agreement started, where it became very complicated because there were other issues that started cropping up or they wanted to be discussed. One issue was that they wanted to discuss the trade in services. What about trade in services that was completely overlooked until then? And it had by then, 1986, become a significant part or proportion of total trade that was being conducted among nations. So trade and services had to be now discussed. So when we're talking of services, you need to talk about intellectual property rights, because services involves intellectual property that needs to be safeguarded legally by different nations. So all these copyright violations that happen, and you are able to buy duplicate products of Microsoft or Adidas or Nike or even Calvin Klein or Guess. These counterfeit market had to was costing a lot to these brands. So now these intellectual rights had to be protected. So that discussion went on to trade and services, and there were a lot of other components that were a challenge at that point in time. How to treat agricultural goods if we want to keep it out of tax net, or are subsidies allowed? There are certain governments who are subsidizing their agricultural produce, so they become very competitive price wise in the international market. Should that be challenged? Should that be discouraged? Or is that a fair deal? So when all these challenges came forward, it was realized that by 1994, no agreement could be reached. So nearly an 8-year period of the Uruguay round of talks, and when no agreement could be reached, it was realized that GATT had become redundant, and so it was replaced by an organization which was called the World Trade Organization, which was signed by, I think, 119 countries at that point in time. India also became a signatory to the World Trade to the WTO in 1995 January, and to comply with its rules and regulations and the laws laid down for international trade, it had to open its economy to freer trade, right? So we have been demolishing or dismantling the trade barriers ever since. Till now, we are trying to make trade easier and foreign investment easier for other countries, because that's a requirement if you want to be a part of the World Trade Order. Right. So this is called the intergovernmental bargaining process. Set rules for international trade. There are regulations that exist under the WTO, and if they are flouted, the two parties, disputing parties, can go to the court of arbitration that was absent under GATT. There was no under GATT. If there was a dispute, the two parties can sit and decide and discuss and kind of iron it out between themselves. But under WTO, there was a court of arbitration that was provisioned, which is going to hear and adjudicate on the dispute that is. Either going to set a new rule or a new precedence, or make a new regulation, or relax some earlier rule, or revise it according to the judgment passed. So dispute settlement mechanism was also provisioned under the WTO. So a multilateral trading system has these three components. Now, if you are a part of WTO, it does not mean that your country cannot be a part of any other regional economic cooperation treaty like there are so many regional trade areas, free trade areas, customs unions, economic union, EU, that is existent in the world. So so the concept or the idea of WTO is the philosophy that it follows is that if any regional cooperation amongst nations is forwarding or adding more to international trade than is challenging it, so than is reducing it, then definitely, because when you have a regional cooperation, for example, you have become a NAFTA, North American free trade area. If you are a NAFTA, the three countries that are a signatory to NAFTA, which three countries are a part of NAFTA? Who's going to tell me? Which three countries are a part of NAFTA? Who's going to tell me? NAFTA. Which three countries make NAFTA or North American Free Trade Area? I will wait.
Is it, madam, Mexico, Canada, and America?
Mexico, Canada, and the US. So if three countries, so now what these three countries do is that they make a free trade area amongst themselves, which might mean a free flow of goods, services, and sometimes as well as labor and capital in that area, right? But anything coming from outside will have to face some tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, but which is against the spirit of WTO. But WTO said that if you know NAFTA is causing trade to grow, world trade to grow rather than diminish it, then it is acceptable. So as a result of that, a lot of regional economic cooperation treaties and arrangements are existing worldwide parallel to WTO, right? Okay, next. So, what are the rules for international trade now after the GATT was replaced by WTO, the main point of contention under GATT was this, in the Dunkel draft that had come out. And what is the Dunkel draft? Dunkel draft is that a proposal that was made by Arthur Dunkel, who which brought out all the shortcomings of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, and proposed certain and proposed the how protection of trade and services, and how trade and agriculture would be dealt with if subsidies. They definitely said that subsidizing agricultural goods was not allowed, which was to the detriment of countries like India, because in India, countries like with a developing country like India, a lot of agricultural activities or all of agricultural activities are mostly subsidized by the government. So it challenged the concept of subsidy, which would have completely given an edge to the developed countries. Yeah. So it was a draft that spoke about trade and services, that spoke about how agriculture trade needs to be treated, and how investment needs to be regulated when as trading system became more globalized, or as the world became more globalized, right? So what is trade related intellectual property? What is TRIPS? TRIPS is trade related intellectual property, right? And so governments created this multilateral rule to protect intellectual property through patents and copyrights. And the issue became clear in the 1980s when and enabled the firms and individuals to make profit by producing a lot of fake counterfeit products. So the companies that were the original producer of that product was suffering monetarily, and even otherwise when their reputation was at stake due to counterfeit product being poor in quality and no service, right? But it was sold as a Nike shoe, and Nike shoe performing bad would also dent its own reputation in the market. So trade related intellectual property rights, governments created multilateral rules for countries that were not enforcing IPR. Most of the developing and underdeveloped world have very poor IPR laws, so they fail to protect the intellectual property as you. So the idea is that as governments protect private property, they should also protect intellectual property. But so now countries like India are coming up when if you want to attract organizations that deal in products that have a lot of patents and copyrights and have a lot of intellectual property issues, like in China, when Starbucks went into China, they immediately had to face a lot of local counterfeiting, where a local coffee house, started a brand that had the look and feel of Starbucks, that used the same color combination and the same logo design, and gave it a name in Chinese that meant something very close to Starbucks, right? So Starbucks challenged it in the Chinese court, and they also won that case or their plea. So that gave a boost to this trade-related intellectual property rights. That if you want to attract these organized, the governments will have to be forthcoming to give a protection to these copyrights and patents of, and that is like why copyrights and patents are there. If you patented a product, then nobody else is allowed to sell that idea or that design, right? Or that, kind of drug. So general agreement of trade in services. So what had been overlooked by GATT was now included in WTO trade related investment measures. Now, so capital investment was also brought into the ambit of world trade, where the developed countries which were investing in underdeveloped or developing countries wanted their investment to be also regulated by certain laws, where they would be guaranteed to when the question arose of repatriation of profits, or anything to do with any trade dispute arising between nations. So because there is a lot of difference in policies and measures that different countries take, there is a lot of different kind of risk that different countries are going to project in terms of the political risk, the economic risk, and the social risk, etc. So there has to be some regulation for trade related investment measures. So WTO also guaranteed some kind of dispute settlement for any of the disputes which was related to investment of private investment into developing countries. Now, the reverse is not the true. That's the irony, which means that at any point in time, if these private investors want to withdraw their money from your country, they are free to do that. So that is why it is said that the rules and regulations of WTO are mostly favors developed countries, and not the developing countries. The developing countries are mostly left at a receiving end when the capital outflow happens, because there is nothing to regulate that capital outflow. You don't have to give any notice, you don't have to take any permissions, you don't have to meet any requirements or criteria before you pull your money out of a country. And that is something that led to the Asian economic crisis of 1997-98. So capital inflow is also a problem, and capital outflow is another problem that developing countries have to deal with. And we are going to discuss this when we are discussing financial crisis. Okay. Now, principles and objectives of a multilateral trading system. The first principle is that it is based on the principle of market-based liberalization. That is the fundamental principle, and it is meant for a liberal trading system. According to this principle, there has to be liberalization of international trade, which means that because it raises the standard of living globally, which means that countries which are trading have to facilitate international trade rather than impede it by bringing about very strict regulations in place and tariffs in place. So first objective of multilateral trading system is that it has to be a free market mechanism. It has to be a free market where government intervention is has to be minimal. Only government should only be administering it rather than trying to impede it. And it has to be a liberal system, which means that bring down the barriers as much as you can so that there's more room for liberal trade and the world can grow together according to the principles of free trade. Principle of non-discrimination. Now, there is a there is a clause of principle of non-discrimination simply means that there is any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity granted by the contracting party to any other country should be granted to the remaining parties also, which means that if US gives some kind of beneficial treatment to Mexico or to Canada, it should extend the same kind of treatment when it comes to imports into its country to even to other countries like India, like Vietnam, like Taiwan, like China. It cannot have that kind of discrimination in place on the basis of diplomatic ties or country with which it on the basis of the country of region of religion. It cannot have those kind of discriminations in place. So it is the principle of reciprocity is the third one, which means that if there are any trade concessions made uh, by one country to the other, similar concession should also flow from the other country to the so US and India and US and China, they should have similar trade concessions. And I think the current government of the United States is bringing about these points that a lot of reciprocity is missing amongst countries, especially when it's comes to trade with China, trade with India. While India and China are placing high tariffs on any commodity that is entering into their country, they are facing they are asking for and facing lesser tariffs in the US. So what US is doing right now, if I'm not wrong, one of the things that US is doing right now is to uh, harp on this principle of reciprocity and say that if you have levied 40% tariff on our wine, then we will also levy 40% tariff on your wine. If you want that to be 10% on your wine, you should also bring it down to 10% on our wine. But that is where, that is where the objectives of trade protection or come from. And so I'm going to discuss this in the next class. Now, it's a principle of domestic safeguards. So some kind of domestic safeguards have to be there, which are the escape clauses that allow governments to temporarily opt out of commitments they have made at the time of change in domestic or international economy for the well-being of their nation. For example, if there is an agreement that has been made and one of the countries wants to opt out of it at a later stage because it feels that rather than benefiting from this clause, it is actually losing out more in terms of revenue or whichever way, it should have the freedom to there should be a clause where it can opt out of that agreement also. For example, when the world price of steel decreased, resulting in the surge of steel imports into the United States that hurt its indigenous American steel producers who lost market to their rival, the safeguards incorporated in the WTO allowed the US to raise the tariffs on imported steel temporarily to protect the American producers. So although tariffs are not in principle are not considered favorable to trade, but you can make use of these tariff barriers if you temporarily want to protect your indigenous industry. So what are the objectives of multilateral trade? Is trade without discrimination. So there comes the clause of most favored nation, like how you are extending some benefits to your most favored trading partner. You have to extend as a country similar benefits to other trading partners also. because it is based on the principle of non-discrimination, right? National treatment, that which means that when an import enters your country must treat it at par with the domestic services, and same kind of rules and regulations must apply to the domestic as well as to foreign goods and services. You can't have different rules apply to so the principle of national treatment comes in. You can't have a difference in the rules that apply to imports and the rules that apply to your own indigenous products. Freer trade, the whole idea of or objective of a multilateral trading system was to promote and ultimately have free trade, which means absolute free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor in the entire world. There should be no restrictions. But you see how US is bringing about very stringent restrictions to the movement of labor into its country by changing its visa and rules, norms, and regulations there. So it is against the objective of multilateral trade. However, that is what is happening because countries sometimes tend to go towards protectionism, and they are using this principle of domestic safeguard to do this, right? They have to safeguard the employment of their own people, the interest of their own society, the survival, the economic, the standard of living of their own Americans before they allow an influx of labor into their country from locations that are mostly China and India. All right. And when so many when Indian and Chinese communities are overwhelmingly present now as citizens, as US citizens in the US nations, then they have also changed the nature of politics there. How vote is cast and what are the factors, this gives rise to another league of politics. So where your original American population is reduced to a minority, and there's an overwhelming majority of non-American groups and Hispanic groups that start determining the course of politics also. Sorry, principle of domestic safeguard, or in both in terms of trade and in terms of sovereignty, is what Trump is using to change the rules and regulations prevalent in the US right. Predictability and stability, these are very important objectives of multilateral trade because the attempt by government to make business environment more stable and predictable is can be done by promising not to raise any trade barrier, not to bring about a new trade clause or raise a new trade barrier. And it is very, very important as keep on lowering, right? So the government of the host country has to promise some kind of stability to the home country. So if somebody is coming into trade with your nation, your government must provide it some stability so that more time series predictions can be made with more stability and greater accuracy, and hence global trade environment becomes more stable than unstable. Now you rise up tomorrow, there's a change in regime in India, and the new government slaps newer tariffs and stricter regulations. So that is going to be against the objective of predictability and stability. Promoting fair competition, you must as a country allow competition to be fair. There is the MFN clause is there, so no discrimination on the basis. So by subsidizing your own industry, that is one way in which you impede fair competition in your country, because the products that come from outside are unable to compete with the subsidized products that are indigenously produced. So if you remember, Shell, Shell came as a petroleum, they opened their uh, fuel stations in India, and they closed down after a couple of years of struggle, and they went back and they have come back again and opened. Now, the problem here is that mostly there are state-owned enterprises in when it comes to petroleum industry in India. So you have BP, you have HP, right? The Indian Oil, these are all government enterprises, and they're heavily subsidized. So the rate or the price at which they per unit price at which they're going to sell petrol to retail consumers is very, very low and definitely not competitive because they are subsidized units, and government subsidizes it in the larger interest of the country's welfare. But when Shell came into a picture, into competition as a completely private player, they could not, they will definitely, they were not availing these subsidies that the government had extended to its public sector units. So they had to sell petrol at a market driven market rate per unit. So at the time when these petrol stations were selling it for 40 to 45 rupees a liter, hovering in this range. They had to sell it at a range between 70 to 75 rupees a liter because they could not avail the subsidies of the government. So they could not compete. No, why would a consumer like me go in and buy petrol, which is almost double the price, when I can get it cheaper? And it's a major, major cost for me because I have to daily drive down to work and go back home. So they had to close down business because they suffered huge losses and they went back. But now that Indian government promised that we are going to sell petrol at market driven prices, they have again come into, but now there are some taxes and levies that they have to pay to the Indian government. So again, their outlet sells fuel at a slightly higher price, right, as compared to HP and BP and from encouraging development and economic reform. So, the objective of multilateral trade is that every country must bring in those kind of structural reforms that help it grow and develop and brings about a development which is an all-round development at the global level. It should not be concentrated to only 7 countries in the world. This development must spread when technical know-how, skill, lifestyle proliferation happens. Those same products and services are available all around the world. When income grows, consumption grows, output grows, the whole world benefits. So it benefits, or it facilitates all round economic development and reform at a global level. So these are the objectives of WTO. So a WTO had these objectives that it had laid down, that the whole idea was to raise the standard of living, to ensure full employment of resources all around the world. Resources are lying idle in countries like Africa, India, China, and there is dearth of resources in those G7 countries, the developed countries. So let those organizations, multinational corporations, utilize or exploit the idle resources of the developing and underdeveloped world and make them also grow, so that there can be growth in real income. And effective demand means the what the total global demand is and what the total global supply is, that you must have learned in macroeconomics. To expand production in goods and services at a global level, because when the market grows, your you can achieve economies of scale by producing more and selling more. So the expansion of production of goods and services can happen. Allow optimal use of world's resources in according with the sustainable development goals. You have to keep sustainability in mind. You cannot, although most of the time this is flouted because these big multinational corporations enter countries like India, where the environmental laws are very, very relaxed and they exploit the world's resources, the resources in a manner that a lot of ecological balance and environmental degradation is caused. But nevertheless, the objective is to always keep in mind the concept of sustainability. Protect and preserve the environment. You must at all times protect and preserve the environment when you operate from another country, although this is often flouted. Effect significant reduction in tariff and other trade barriers to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international trade. So all tariff and non-tariff barriers must be brought down so that there is non-discrimination, this principle of trade without discrimination can be effected. to ensure developing countries secure a share in the growth in international trade, which is commensurate with their needs of economic development, which means that only developed countries must not grow at the cost of developing countries. The development must happen of the developing nations also, which is in tandem with the requirements or needs of economic development that these countries have. So there should so WTO must any international trade must help all countries to grow in a similar manner rather than one at the cost of the other. So the concept of Pareto optimality of welfare economics, that is one being someone being better off without anyone else being worse off. The functions of WTO are to facilitate the implementation, administration, and operation of multilateral and plurilateral trade agreements. So all NAFTA, ASEAN kind of trade agreements, which are plurilateral trade agreements, if there is any kind of dispute here, they will provide adjudication. They also are covered under WTO. To secure the implementation of reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers agreed in trade negotiations, to provide a dispute settlement mechanism to adjudicate trade disputes, to cooperate with other international institutions like IMF and IBRD. So there are other institutions like International Monetary Fund and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Right. So there should be cooperation with other international institutions also when if you are a part of the world signatory to WTO, which means if you are taking loan from IMF and there are some conditions that IMF puts, you must abide by it. Right. And if you're taking loan from here for reconstruction and development, you must abide by the clauses here as well. So this automatically asks you to abide by all rules and regulations for all international organizations. To act as a watchdog for international trade, that is the primary function. They administrate or administer international trade. They look over it, right? To be responsible for periodic review of trade policies of member nations, you must keep reviewing it because times are dynamic, requirements, needs keep changing. The whole global dynamics keep changing. For example, countries like India, Africa, and all are asking for a lot of changes to be brought about in the policies of WTO and IMF because they feel that they are more in favor of the developed countries and less in favor of the underdeveloped countries. For example, your trading currency can only be either a euro or a US dollar. Why? So that is one question that is being raised. Then a lot of other such disconnects are there that need to be rediscussed. So there has to be a continuous review of these trade policies of the member nations. All right, so we are going to take this further in the next class and we will discuss the economic and regional cooperation in our next class and the financial crisis. We are going to start there. All right, so if there are any questions, I'm ready to take in the last 10 minutes. I'm ready to take any questions in the last 10 minutes. You can unmute and ask. All right, so we'll see you in the next class. Thank you so much for joining.